there's no telling. I mean, I can think of times when I said, oh my gosh, that was an angelic visitation. 2 times. And I've only got time to tell you one of them right now. But so I want your listeners to know that in all of my decades of ministry, I can only think of 2 times that I can point to and say, that was an angelic visitation. So what happened was, I was invited into this family's life as a young pastor because there was a young woman in our community in her early 20s who was in the hospital, and she was dying, and she was pregnant with their 2nd child. I did not know her personally or really any of that family, but through people in my church, they introduced me and said, Pastor Carl, could you minister to them? Right now, most of the family's unchurched, and this horrible thing has happened in their life. And what happened was, the young woman, beautiful, beautiful young woman, 22 years old, 23, I think, they already had a 4-year-old child, she and her husband. They married young, had a 4-year-old, beautiful little girl. They said, please go minister to this girl, she's dying. And the family's just devastated. Well, I got there and I found out that I went to visit her in ICU with the family's permission. And sure enough, she was pregnant with their 2nd child, but she had contracted a disease that was going to kill her. And I'm not going to go into the details to protect the privacy of the family, but when I tell the story publicly, this is how I tell it. But I was able to lead that young woman to the Lord in ICU. She was fully aware, fully conscious. I talked to her for the longest, prayed with her, asked her if she was ready to receive Jesus Christ as Savior after presenting the gospel with tears streaming down her face. She said yes. She prayed for the Lord to forgive her. She gave her life to Christ. It was very moving, very beautiful. So I departed. I went back several times before she passed away and spoke with her. I told the family. They were elated, but they're still just devastated by what's getting ready to happen. Well, sure enough, they decided to do a section on the mother to take the child before she died. So they did. The little baby was born as another little girl, and the mother passed away. Just as sad as you can get, brother, as far humanly speaking. But we did rejoice that she had given her life to the Lord. Very popular young lady, beautiful young lady. Her husband was just this great popular guy. So the funeral was huge, huge. The sanctuary was filled. The parking lot was outfilled. The funeral home put speakers in the parking lot. That's how huge it was. They asked me to preach the funeral. Well, I don't mind telling you, as a young pastor going through all of that, standing in front of a crowd that big to preach a funeral, I was excited about the opportunity to preach the gospel to so many, and I was anxious for many of her friends to hear that she had given her life to Christ and to give that testimony. On the other hand, I was terrified because the family was grieving. All of her friends, especially the lost friends, were just weeping and wailing. I mean, it was just horrific. And the grandfather was sitting there holding this newborn. He was holding the 4-year-old in his lap. Behind him was his son, who was the husband, holding the newborn, then family all around him. So it was just a sad scene. And I can remember getting up in the pulpit and praying, Lord, please give me the words. I'm scared to death, but I'm not afraid of public speaking. I'm not afraid of preaching. I relish those opportunities, but this was pretty unnerving. And I prayed, Lord, if you could give me some supernatural, whatever that means, just surround me with your presence. Give me some help, because I don't want to blow this. And I just felt this peace come over me. So I started preaching. About halfway through my message, and it was not a lengthy message, but I was sharing about this girl coming to Christ. I looked over in the family section and I saw the grandfather with the 4-year-old in his lap. And the 4-year-old was whispering in the grandfather's ear and looking out of the corner of her eye and pointing at me. And the grandfather's eyes were about that big, and his jaw was open, and he was looking at me. And I'm telling you, Sam, my first thought was, I've really messed up. I've said something wrong. I've said somebody's name wrong. I've remembered something wrong. I've misspoken. And I'm telling you, I was unnerved again. And I started praying, Lord, give me strength. Give me strength. And I felt a peace come over me, and I kept going. Well, after I did the closing prayer, and the funeral home directors were kind of directing the crowd, I slipped down out of the pulpit. I went right over to where the family was. I was speaking to them, kind of comforting them, because they were still torn up about everything. But I went over to the grandfather, who's still holding his granddaughter, and I said, did I say something wrong? What was all that about? And he said, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay. Still holding his granddaughter, this is what he told me. He said, while you were preaching, my granddaughter whispered in my ear and asked me who that man all in white was who was standing beside you in the pulpit. And I told her, I said, baby, this is a 4-year-old little girl that wasn't even going to church. She don't know anything about angels or, Jesus dressed all in white or whatever. And he told me, he says, she would have no knowledge of this. And I thought maybe she was just confused or grieving. And I said, baby, there's no man up there. And she took her Papa's head with her hand and said, Papa, don't you see him? He's standing beside the preacher. And he said, baby, do you see a man dressed all in white? She says, yes, Papa. He said, and so he said he started looking around in the congregation to see if maybe there was some guy in a white suit, and nobody was dressed like that. And so he looked back at her and he said, have you ever seen this man before? And she says, no, he's standing there now, Papa. And she said, he's standing right beside the preacher. And she said, but he did come and talk to me right before the preacher did and told me that my mommy was okay and that everything was going to be fine. And I thought you saw him then. And the grandfather looked at me and says, preacher, I'm telling you the truth. And the little girl looked at me with this little 4-year-old look on her face like, my papa's telling you the truth, mister. And so I'm telling you, brother, I couldn't speak, Sam. And I realized I had prayed and I had asked God, give me some supernatural strength. This was one of the toughest funerals I'd ever had to do. And I felt that peace come over me several times. And now I'm standing here talking to the grandfather. I didn't see the angel. He didn't. But this little girl who knew nothing about any of this, she's adamant about it all through the funeral. She's trying to get her grandfather to see this and says that this angelic being came and spoke to her. So I'm telling you, Sam, that rocked my world. And it really gave this, when I was a young pastor, this perspective that, you know what? The Word of God tells us that sometimes we're entertaining angels unaware, that they are there as fellow servants. They are there to lift us up. They are there to encourage us. They are there to protect us. I think I was being protected that day. I think I was being encouraged. And I have lived my life, in my ministry life, ever since, very keenly aware of the supernatural realm and the truth of it. And it came through a 4-year-old little girl out of the mouth of babes. And by the way, the Bible speaks of the angels, the children and their angels. And I mean, so there was nothing unbiblical about what she said. I measure everything. I mean, if she had come up with this wild thing that it came down in a UFO and, I said, well, poor baby, she ate some bad pizza. But everything she said was so worshipful. It was so true, so sincere. She was a little girl. She had no idea of these things. And it matched perfectly with the Word of God and with my prayer. But my very first experience that I can remember right now was that one. And it's just emblazoned upon my mind and my soul. I hope it's interesting to your listeners and viewers, but it's the truth. So help me, Lord, it's the truth.
The Satanists wanted to install their own tribute, a pagan idol, on the Capitol grounds, right next to the Ten Commandments.
Billions around the planet are witnessing a world in the grasp of sadistic spiritual darkness. This unholy alliance has infected our governments, our religious institutions, and our societies. The world appears to be unraveling. But can the evil behind these dark supernatural forces be defeated? Is everything playing out just as the Bible predicted it will in the final days? At last, you can know the answers to mankind's most urgent questions and learn your destiny among today's events in the new, unprecedented work taking the prophecy world by storm. Gods and Thrones, Nakash, Forgotten Prophecy and the Return of the Elohim by best-selling author, former decorated law enforcement officer, and senior pastor Carl Gallups. This changes everything. Available now wherever fine books are sold.